The courtroom buzzed with an electric tension. The air seemed almost too heavy to move through, as if the walls themselves were holding in the weight of the moment. Seated in the center of the room was retired Captain Mark Reynolds, a man whose stoic demeanor was betrayed by the slight tremor in his hands. His wheelchair gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and on his lap rested a hand tightly gripping the leash of Shadow, a stoic German shepherd sitting loyally by his side. To everyone in the room, Shadow was just another military working dog. But to Mark, Shadow was a lifeline, a beacon that had pulled him back from the edge time and time again. They were inseparable, a bond forged through fire and blood in the chaos of war zones. Yet, the Army now intended to reassign Shadow, declaring him government property essential for a new mission. Mark adjusted the medals on his uniform, his fingers brushing over them as though they were weights tethering him to a life he no longer recognized. As the judge called for his statement, Mark inhaled deeply, his voice trembling but resolute. "Your Honor," he began, his tone filled with emotion, "Shadow isn't just a dog or a piece of equipment. He saved my life more times than I can count. When the enemy fire rained down, Shadow pulled me to safety. He warned me of hidden explosives when I couldn't see them. And when I returned home, broken and lost, it was Shadow who kept me alive. He didn't leave me when the nightmares came, when the silence felt unbearable. Please don't take him from me now. I've already lost so much." The room hung on his every word. Some spectators wiped at tears, others whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from anger to deep sympathy. The judge leaned forward, his face unreadable as he prepared to give his ruling. Suddenly, Shadow stood, pulling the leash free from Mark's trembling grasp. The sharp sound of Shadow's bark echoed through the courtroom, silencing every murmur. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the dog trotted purposefully toward the judge, his movements precise yet non-threatening. "Shadow, no!" Mark called out, his voice cracking with fear. But something in his gut told him that Shadow wasn't acting out of defiance. The bailiffs instinctively moved forward, unsure of the dog's intentions. Yet, Shadow's calm demeanor made them hesitate. He stopped just before the judge, barking again, sharp and insistent. His eyes were locked onto the man in the robe, his posture almost pleading. The judge blinked, startled but composed. He leaned back slightly, as though trying to make sense of what Shadow was doing. Mark's heart raced as he called out again, "Shadow, come!" Shadow turned his head briefly, his expressive eyes meeting Mark's as if to say, "I've got this." Then, he looked back at the judge and let out a softer bark, followed by a low whine. The judge's stern expression wavered, a flicker of something softer crossing his face. He tapped his gavel lightly, signaling the room to remain calm. "It seems Shadow has something to say," he remarked, his tone laced with a surprising gentleness. He leaned closer, meeting Shadow's gaze. The dog wagged his tail once, his stance firm but calm. The room seemed to collectively exhale, captivated by the exchange. Mark's voice broke the silence, this time softer, filled with emotion. "Your Honor, Shadow doesn't need words to show you what he's already shown me: loyalty, courage, and heart. Please let him stay." The judge took a long pause, his gaze moving between Mark and Shadow. Finally, he straightened in his chair and cleared his throat. "It's not every day we witness a case like this," he began, his voice steady. "Shadow isn't just a dog, he's a hero, and more importantly, he's family." The judge's gavel came down with a resounding thud. "Shadow will remain with Captain Reynolds." Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted into applause, tears streaming down the faces of many. Mark slumped in his wheelchair, relief washing over him as Shadow trotted back, pressing his head against Mark's chest. "You did it, buddy," Mark whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Shadow wagged his tail, licking Mark's hand as if to say, "We did it together." The judge, who had been poised to reprimand Mark moments ago, now froze in his seat, his gavel resting forgotten in his hand. His stern gaze softened with unease, flickering between the dog and the direction of Shadow's focus. Around the room, murmurs swelled like a wave, spectators exchanging nervous glances, unsure of what was unfolding. "Captain Reynolds," the judge finally spoke, his voice tinged with apprehension, "explain this behavior." What is Shadow detecting? Mark exhaled sharply, his military training kicking in. Your Honor, Shadow is trained to detect threats, explosives, danger, anything out of place. This isn't a dog misbehaving. He's warning us. The words sent a ripple through the room, fear taking root in the previously sympathetic crowd. A low, guttural growl rumbled from Shadow's throat, drawing every gaze back to him. His eyes never wavered from the far corner of the room, where a maintenance door stood slightly ajar. The growl deepened, a sound that made the hair on the back of everyone's neck stand on end. Mark's mind raced, memories of the battlefield flashing like lightning. Shadow had saved his life countless times with this same alertness, detecting dangers Mark hadn't seen until it was almost too late. We need to clear the room, Mark said, his voice firm and commanding. The bailiffs exchanged uncertain glances, torn between protocol and the undeniable urgency in Mark's tone. The judge hesitated for a moment before nodding. Clear the courtroom, he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of authority. As people began filing out in hurried silence, Shadow advanced slowly toward the door, his steps deliberate and his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Mark wheeled himself forward, his voice calm but insistent. Stay back, he warned, his eyes on Shadow. Let him work. Shadow reached the door and stopped abruptly, his body going rigid. He barked once, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed through the now empty courtroom. Mark's stomach twisted. This was the final alert. Something was there. A security officer stepped forward cautiously, glancing at Mark for approval. With a nod, the officer opened the door wider. Behind it, hidden in the shadows, was a small, suspiciously wired device. The room seemed to collectively gasp as the officer quickly backed away, radioing for the bomb squad. The judge, now pale, turned to Mark. You and Shadow just saved all of us. Mark's hand found Shadow's head, giving him a firm pat. No, Your Honor, he said, his voice filled with emotion. Shadow saved me again. Shadow's low, menacing growl cut through the air like a warning siren, freezing the entire courtroom in place. Retired Captain Mark Reynolds clenched the armrests of his wheelchair, his breath shallow and his pulse pounding in his ears. Shadow's body remained rigid, his gaze locked on the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the room, as if daring whatever danger lay beyond to show itself. The judge, who moments earlier had been poised to reprimand Mark, now sat frozen, his gavel forgotten in his hand. A ripple of unease swept through the spectators, turning their murmurs into whispers of fear. Mark's voice broke the silence, steady despite the rising dread in his chest. Shadow doesn't react like this without reason. He's trained to sense danger. The tension in the room thickened. One of the bailiffs, his hand resting nervously on the holster at his hip, took a hesitant step forward. It's probably nothing, he muttered, his words faltering as Shadow's growl deepened. The dog's ears were pinned back, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. Mark wheeled himself forward, his voice cutting through the thick silence. Stop, let him work. Shadow's intense focus shifted slightly as he sniffed the air, then he barked a single, sharp sound that echoed off the courtroom walls. The sound sent a jolt through everyone present, a primal warning no one could ignore. Shadow inched closer to the doors, his steps deliberate. Mark's throat tightened as he watched his partner. The bailiffs exchanged uneasy glances before one of them pushed the doors open cautiously. A metallic click echoed faintly, and then it appeared a device, small but deadly, rigged against the doorframe. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The judge's face went pale, his voice a whisper. How? Mark exhaled, his hand finding Shadow's head. Because he knows. Shadow always knows. In that moment, Shadow was more than a dog, he was a hero, once again saving lives in the face of danger. Shadow's growl deepened into a guttural rumble, cutting through the tense air like a blade. Retired Captain Mark Reynolds gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his heart pounding with the weight of familiarity. He had seen Shadow in this state before, alert, tense, and unwavering in the presence of unseen danger. Shadow doesn't do this for no reason, Mark called out, his voice firm but edged with urgency. He's trained to detect threats. Whatever's out there, we need to take it seriously. The judge, visibly unnerved, nodded to the bailiffs. "Check it out, carefully." The larger bailiff moved toward the heavy wooden doors, his every step cautious. Shadow's body remained taut, his barking sharp and clipped as his focus followed the man's approach. The bailiff reached for the handle, his hand trembling slightly as it gripped the cold metal. The room held its collective breath, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. As the door creaked open, revealing a dim hallway beyond, Shadow's barks intensified. The bailiff stepped into the hallway, his body stiff with unease. He scanned the shadows, his hand hovering near his weapon. Suddenly, he froze. "There's something here," he said, his voice tight with alarm. Mark's pulse quickened. He leaned forward, his chest heavy with dread. "What do you see?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though his mind raced with possibilities. The bailiff didn't answer immediately, his eyes locked on the far end of the hallway. Shadow's growls deepened, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. The larger bailiff took another hesitant step forward, his boots clicking softly on the floor. The faint glint of something metallic caught the light a device, small but deadly, rigged near the doorway. "Bomb!" the bailiff yelled, stumbling back into the room. Chaos erupted. The judge slammed his gavel, shouting for calm as panic rippled through the crowd. Shadow barked furiously, his warning clear and urgent. Mark's voice cut through the din. "Evacuate the room! Now!" People scrambled toward the exits, the weight of Shadow's instincts proving once again that his vigilance wasn't just remarkable, it was life-saving. Mark reached down to steady his loyal companion, his voice filled with gratitude. "You did it again, boy." Shadow's sharp eyes met Mark's, and for a moment, amidst the chaos, the bond between man and dog spoke louder than words. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, every second stretching endlessly as retired Captain Mark Reynolds gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. His loyal companion, Shadow, strained against the leash, his barks echoing like an alarm through the heavy silence. "I'm telling you," Mark's voice cut through the rising panic. "Shadow doesn't react like this for no reason. He's trained to sense danger, even before we can see it." The larger bailiff tightened his grip on his weapon, his gaze darting toward the dim hallway. The smaller bailiff aimed his flashlight into the shadows, the beam slicing through the darkness and illuminating the polished floor. "It's empty," he said, his voice tight. "There's nothing there." Yet his trembling hand betrayed his unease. Shadow's growl deepened, his body rigid as his barking intensified. His focus never wavered, locked on the corridor as if he could see what the others could not. Mark leaned forward, his chest tightening with the weight of memories. He had heard the phrase "too quiet" countless times on the battlefield, and it always meant one thing: danger was near. "Get everyone out," Mark commanded, his voice rising with urgency. "We need to evacuate now." The crowd remained frozen. The judge, visibly shaken, glanced toward the bailiffs for reassurance. But before anyone could act, a sharp metallic clang reverberated through the hallway. The sound was piercing, jarring in the suffocating quiet. The smaller bailiff stumbled back, his flashlight beam jerking as he lost his composure. Shadow lunged toward the sound, his barks ferocious, claws scraping against the floor as he strained against the leash. "What the hell was that?" The larger bailiff shouted, his weapon now drawn, his voice laced with alarm. Mark's heart pounded as he shouted above the chaos. Shadow's never wrong. Something's coming, something dangerous. His certainty sent a ripple of unease through the room. Whatever was out there, Shadow had sensed it, and Mark knew better than anyone it was only a matter of time. The sharp metallic clang reverberated through the room again, louder and closer this time, its eerie resonance slicing through the tension like a blade. The air was suffocating, thick with an unseen menace that sent shivers down every spine. Shadow barked ferociously, his body taut as a bowstring, straining against the leash with an intensity that screamed urgency. Retired Captain Mark Reynolds gripped Shadow's leash with trembling hands, his knuckles white. His pulse thundered in his ears, an all-too-familiar sensation of impending danger washing over him. "Shadow doesn't react like this without a reason," Mark said, his voice tight but commanding. "We need to get everyone out now." Despite his warning, the room remained frozen, fear rooting everyone to their spots. The judge, his gavel trembling slightly in his grip, called out, "What do you see?" His voice cracked, betraying the unease beneath his usual air of authority. The larger bailiff stepped deeper into the hallway, his weapon drawn, his movements slow and deliberate. "Nothing yet," he muttered, though his tone was strained, his unease evident. His partner followed cautiously, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the shadows, but the corridor remained empty. Silent, still. Yet Shadow's stance didn't waver. His growls deepened, a low, menacing rumble that seemed to vibrate through the courtroom, more effective than any alarm. Mark's gut twisted. Shadow wasn't just reacting, he was locked onto something. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, spectators clutching belongings and inching toward the exits. The room's atmosphere shifted, panic bubbling just below the surface. Mark wheeled himself forward, his focus unwavering on Shadow. The dog had gone silent again, his ears rigid, his eyes fixed on the dark hallway. His body was motionless, like a predator preparing to strike. "Shadow's locked onto something," Mark said, his voice trembling with the weight of certainty. "And whatever it is, it's coming." The room fell into a tense, suffocating silence as the shadow moved again, deliberate and purposeful. The sound of its heavy footsteps echoed, each one reverberating through the courtroom like a grim announcement. Shadow's growls deepened into an ominous snarl, his body surging against the leash with such force that Mark Reynolds had to grip his wheelchair tightly to keep himself steady. "Get out of there!" Mark's voice cut through the chaos like a whip, sharp and commanding. His eyes were locked on the dark hallway, the dread pooling in his chest growing heavier by the second. Shadow's instincts had never been wrong, and Mark knew whatever was in that hallway wasn't just a threat, it was calculated, intentional. The larger bailiff, his face pale but determined, held his ground, his weapon trained on the darkness. His partner, trembling visibly, swept the flashlight beam across the hallway again, the beam jittering as it caught every shifting shadow. "There's someone there," the smaller man stammered, his voice barely audible over Shadow's relentless snarls. The light flickered across a tall silhouette, looming and motionless for just a heartbeat before it disappeared back into the shadows. The courtroom erupted into panicked murmurs, spectators clutching at their belongings as they edged toward the exits. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, his voice straining for control. "Everyone, stay calm." But calm was impossible. The footsteps resumed, louder now, deliberate as they grew closer. Each step seemed to drain the air from the room, filling it with an oppressive weight. Shadow barked furiously, his body trembling with raw tension, as if ready to spring into the unknown. The larger bailiff's voice broke through the mounting chaos, tight and commanding. "Who's there?" "Show yourself." His gun remained steady, though his knuckles were white from the grip. The answer came not in words, but in movement, a slow, deliberate emergence from the darkness. Whatever was coming was no longer content to stay hidden. Mark's chest tightened as he leaned forward, every instinct screaming that the danger was far worse than anyone in the room could comprehend. And as the figure began to take shape, the room braced itself for the unthinkable. The atmosphere in the courtroom was suffocating, every breath thick with tension. The hooded figure remained partially in the flashlight's beam, his hands raised slightly as if mocking the situation. Shadow's growls filled the room, a relentless warning that sent shivers through every spine. Retired Captain Mark Reynolds struggled to keep the dog from lunging, his knuckles white as he gripped the leash. He could feel it deep in his gut. This was far from ordinary. The larger bailiff held his ground, his weapon locked on the stranger. "Step forward, slowly," he commanded, his voice betraying a slight tremor despite his effort to sound authoritative. The man tilted his head again, his hood obscuring his face, and then, with eerie calm, he obeyed, taking one deliberate step closer. Each movement was slow, calculated, as though he reveled in the unease radiating through the room. The smaller bailiff edged forward cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam wavered over the stranger's figure, casting sharp shadows that seemed to stretch and distort across the walls. "Stay right there," he barked, his voice higher than intended, betraying the crack in his nerves. Shadow's barks turned into feral snarls, his body taut as a coiled spring, ready to strike. Mark's voice was low but firm as he muttered under his breath, "Easy, Shadow. Stay with me." Yet his heart was racing. He'd seen men like this before, men who thrived on chaos and fear. Shadow wasn't wrong. Something about this man was deeply, unnervingly wrong. The man's gaze shifted toward Mark, though his hood still shrouded his face. "Ah," he said with a faint smirk. The soldier and his dog. Always so perceptive. The smaller bailiff took another hesitant step forward, his flashlight now steady, but his hand visibly shaking. "Don't move," he warned, his voice strained. "Stay where you are." The man sighed dramatically, as though bored with the tension he'd created. "Fine," he said, lowering his hands ever so slightly. "But I think you should focus on what's behind you." The room froze. Shadow's growls shifted direction, his head snapping toward the courtroom's far corner. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Something else was here. In that moment, the true weight of the situation settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Whatever this man was, whatever his intentions, he wasn't alone. The sharp metallic click echoed in the courtroom like a gunshot, silencing every voice and halting every movement. All eyes were on the hooded man, his smirk widening as if he reveled in the unease he had created. Shadow's barking rose to a crescendo, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. Retired Captain Mark Reynolds gripped the leash with trembling hands, his instincts screaming louder than the cacophony around him. "Stand down," the larger bailiff shouted, his weapon aimed unwaveringly at the man. "Drop the key and step back now." But the man didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto Mark with a cold, piercing intensity. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and eerily calm. "This isn't about me. It's about him." He nodded toward Shadow, his gaze lingering on the German shepherd whose snarls filled the air. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. "How do you know, Shadow?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the tension. "What do you want?" The man tilted his head, his smirk never faltering. "Your dog is special, Captain. He sees things, knows things. You've felt it, haven't you? Out there, on the battlefield. He's more than a companion. He's a weapon." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, their weight suffocating. Mark's stomach churned as memories of Shadow's uncanny instincts flashed through his mind, every life-saving alert, every warning bark that had pulled him back from the brink of death. "He's not a weapon," Mark spat, his voice trembling with anger. "He's my partner. My family." The man chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Family? That's touching. But you have no idea what he's capable of, do you?" Before Mark could respond, the courtroom erupted into chaos. The smaller bailiff shouted, "Stay where you are," as the man took a deliberate step forward, his hands still holding the key. Shadow lunged, his claws scraping against the floor, his growls turning feral. The dog was ready to act, and Mark could barely hold him back. "Everyone out!" Mark shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "Get out now!" Panic rippled through the room. Spectators scrambled for the exits, clutching their belongings as the hooded man remained unnervingly still, watching the chaos unfold like a conductor, orchestrating a symphony. The larger bailiff stepped closer, his weapon shaking in his hands. "Last warning," he growled. "Drop the key, or I'll shoot." But the man simply raised his hands, his smirk replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "Go ahead," he said, his tone dripping with confidence. "But it won't change what's coming." In a flash, the room plunged into darkness. The lights flickered and died, leaving the courtroom in an eerie silence broken only by Shadow's relentless barking. Mark's heart raced as he strained to see through the inky blackness. He could feel Shadow's tension through the leash, the dog's body vibrating with urgency. And then, from the shadows, the man's voice rang out, chilling and full of certainty. "You're out of time." The atmosphere in the courtroom was suffocating, charged with a mix of fear and raw tension. Shadow's barking echoed relentlessly, his body coiled like a spring ready to strike. Retired Captain Mark Reynolds tightened his grip on the leash, his knuckles white as his wheelchair inched forward. His instincts, honed on countless battlefields, screamed that this was no ordinary threat. The stranger stood firm, his calm demeanor at odds with the chaos erupting around him. Behind him, the two shadowy figures loomed closer, their weapons glinting ominously in the flickering light. Their presence felt like an approaching storm, cold and inevitable. "You're not taking him," Mark said, his voice firm despite the tremor of emotion. His words cut through the cacophony of shouts and scraping chairs. "Shadow is more than a dog. He's my partner, my family." The stranger tilted his head slightly, his faint smirk reappearing. "That's touching," he replied, his tone smooth yet chilling. "But you don't understand, Captain. Shadow isn't just a dog. He's a key, a weapon, a force that can tip the scales." Shadow growled low, his sharp eyes locked on the stranger with unrelenting intensity. Mark could feel the tremors of the dog's muscles through the leash, a vibrating readiness that spoke of danger. The larger bailiff stepped closer, his flashlight beam steady on the stranger. "Drop your weapons and back away now," he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. The stranger's smirk deepened. "You think I came here unprepared?" he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "This isn't about negotiations. It's about inevitability." With those words, the figures behind him moved in unison, their steps deliberate and synchronized. Shadow barked furiously, lunging against the leash as if he could drive them back through sheer force of will. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, his voice straining above the chaos. "Order! Everyone! Calm down!" But the room was anything but calm. Spectators surged toward the exits, their movements frantic as fear gripped them. The metallic clang of weapons and the unrelenting growls of Shadow amplified the panic. Mark's eyes darted between Shadow, the advancing figures, and the stranger. His mind raced. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice sharp. "Shadow isn't just a weapon. He's a protector, and he won't let you win." The stranger's gaze flickered toward Shadow, his smirk unwavering. "We'll see about that," he said. And with a deliberate step forward, the battle for Shadow truly began. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively, the air heavy with unspoken fear and lingering tension. Retired Captain Mark Reynolds sat rooted in his wheelchair, his hand firmly gripping Shadow's leash. The German Shepherd, his loyal partner, sat at his side, his body still coiled like a spring, ready to defend. The stranger's chilling words echoed in Mark's mind. "You think this is just about the dog? It's much bigger than that." Mark's pulse thundered in his ears as he replayed the confrontation in his head. The stranger's sharp, calculating eyes and the eerie calm that radiated from him weren't something Mark could easily forget. Nor could he shake the memory of the two ominous figures standing silently behind the man, their presence as menacing as any enemy Mark had ever faced on the battlefield. "Shadow," Mark murmured, his voice low but steady. The dog's ears perked slightly, his head turning to meet Mark's gaze. "You did good, buddy. Real good." The dog leaned against Mark's leg, his growl subsiding, but his body still radiating alertness. Mark reached down, running a hand over Shadow's head, grounding himself in the moment. This was far from over, but for now, they had held their ground. The judge, visibly shaken, cleared his throat. "This court is adjourned," he declared, his voice barely audible over the murmurs rippling through the crowd. He slammed the gavel down one last time before retreating, his composure hanging by a thread. Spectators slowly filed out, their voices low and filled with speculation. Some glanced back at Mark and Shadow as if expecting the dog to spring into action again. The bailiffs exchanged uneasy looks, their postures still tense as they flanked the exits. Mark stayed where he was, his mind racing. Who was that man? Why Shadow? The questions burned in his thoughts, but the answers felt frustratingly out of reach. What he did know, however, was that the stranger's parting words were a promise and a threat. "This isn't over," Mark said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. His gaze remained locked on the courtroom doors, as if willing the answers to walk back through them. He knew Shadow's instincts had never failed him before. The dog had sensed danger, and that danger wasn't gone. It was waiting, lurking, and planning its next move. As the last of the crowd exited, the silence in the room grew deafening. Shadow finally relaxed, lowering himself to the ground but keeping his eyes on the doorway. Mark's hand rested on the dog's head, a gesture of both reassurance and silent gratitude. He let out a long, steady breath, the weight of the moment settling into his chest. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a partner, a protector, and a friend. And no matter what the stranger thought, Shadow belonged to no one but Mark. Mark wheeled himself toward the exit, Shadow walking faithfully by his side. The fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. But as long as they had each other, Mark knew they could take on whatever came next. The story of retired Captain Mark Reynolds and Shadow serves as a powerful metaphor for resilience, trust, and the unbreakable bonds that guide us through life's uncertainties. Shadow's unwavering loyalty and ability to sense danger reflect the importance of intuition and preparedness in navigating challenges. In real life, this translates to fostering trust in relationships, listening to your instincts, and staying alert to potential risks, whether emotional, professional, or physical. Mark's determination to protect Shadow mirrors our need to stand firm in our values and priorities, even when external forces try to shake them. From this story, a key lesson is the importance of building strong partnerships, whether with loved ones, colleagues, or within communities. Just as Shadow stood by Mark, we must nurture relationships that offer mutual support and rely on those we trust when facing adversity. Equally, Mark's ability to remain calm under pressure reminds us to stay composed in times of chaos, focusing on solutions rather than succumbing to fear or uncertainty. To apply these lessons in your own life, trust your instincts, like Shadow's keen senses. Your intuition often detects risks or opportunities before your rational mind does. Pay attention to it and act accordingly. Stand firm in your values. When faced with challenges, hold on to your principles. Protect what matters most to you, whether it's a goal, a relationship, or your personal integrity. Build resilient bonds. Invest in relationships that offer support and understanding. These connections will serve as your foundation during tough times. Stay prepared and alert, like Mark. Be proactive in recognizing and addressing challenges before they escalate. By embracing these principles, you can navigate life's unpredictability with strength and clarity, ensuring that, like Mark and Shadow, you remain steadfast and unshaken in the face of adversity. If you enjoyed today's story, give it a rating from 1 to 10. We'd love to hear your thoughts, reactions, and ideas for future stories. Your feedback helps us make the channel even better. Don't forget to subscribe so you can catch new videos every day. Have an awesome day.